Welcome to the City Movement Podcast. Here at the City Movement, we are passionate about planting churches and YMCAs. So today you'll hear us talk about the YMCA, the local church, and the benefits of the church YMCA partnership. We're your hosts, Jeff Snyder and Mike Newman. Thanks for spending some time with us today. We're back with part 2 of our episode with Doug Pollock, Enter into Their Brokenness. We're going to continue our conversation on noticing people around you, taking the time to slow down and enter into other people's pain. We just left off with Doug sharing the story about he and one of his peers noticing a man who was photographing a moose. In Colorado, we're going to finish that story and then talk about our takeaways together. Thanks for joining us. And that is, I love the, it's like we can have taglines, which are really good, but I want to make sure we actually know, what does that actually mean? You said something about it. The work of an evangelist is entering into the conversation that God is already having.
Uh-huh.
How? What does that look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What is that? Because what I assume you're saying is like, we see in Scripture that, everyone sees evidences of God in the world. Like they're there.
Mm-hmm.
And so in some way, God is having conversations with everyone because they're noticing him. Even sounds like there was a conversation with this guy already happening internally in terms of like, why am I doing this?
Yes.
Why has God made me this way? So what is that
Spirit
actually
drawing him? Yeah. Is that because dead people don't talk, but they can suppress truth. So there is conversation going on.
Yeah. So what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, I think you're on it, Mike. The fact that God desires that none should perish. So he's drawing people, and I think one of the ways he draws them is through these thirst in their soul. He has hardwired us.
Yeah.
Ecclesiastes says, that we are essentially spiritual beings. That we've been there's something in us that is longing for something that this otherworldly, and whether it be love, acceptance, belonging, or some of the things I mentioned about, trying to find peace and anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
These are at work in people's hearts and lives and souls. And it's God using those hunger or soul thirst to draw them towards himself. Yeah. And I think when we pick up on that, I think the privilege we have is maybe stepping in and saying, hey, let me see if I'm hearing you correctly. And so we play back to them, hey, it sounds like you're really struggling to find peace in this crazy, chaotic world. And have you ever considered another alternative to maybe the way you're trying to get peace in this world? And so I always believe it's important that we ask for permission before we enter into, or if you would, share good news with people, because if I'm going to be respectful of them, they might not
That's right.
really want to go there.
That's a great point.
And First Peter says that we need to be gentle and respectful. And if I'm going someplace where there's a boundary and they're like, no, danger, no, this is not a place for you to go.
Yeah.
Then I'm stepping over that boundary. And so I've learned that if I ask for permission, and in this story, I don't know if I highlighted or emphasized it, but I said, hey, I'm wondering if you'd be willing, for me to share a hunch that I have in terms of why you're doing this.
Right.
That was kind of my asking for permission.
That's good.
Yeah.
And he was like, very intrigued. Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. And so I think we get this idea from Augustine, who said, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless. They're longing, they're thirsting for something until they find their rest in you. So I think this entering into God's conversation is part of how he's hardwired us. He's hardwired us to he's put eternity inside of us somehow, and we're longing for something in this world. Kind of like birds fly south in the winter.
Yeah. People
have these soul thirst. Pascal put it this way: there's a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of each man which cannot be satisfied by any created thing, but only by God the Creator, made known through Jesus Christ. So we see another example there. C.S. Lewis I think speaks to this inner thirst. He said, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world.
Mm.
So I think that, what we need to understand when we walk into any YMCA, people are all trying to meet these needs in different ways.
Yep.
And our privilege, I think, is to enter in and find out how that's happening for people, and to be ready to step into this hunger and thirsting that's going on, and asking for permission to maybe share something that would help point them in the right direction versus the direction they've been going.
Yeah. Doug, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I know we're kind of wrapping up, but you're a chaplain. You quoted C.S. Lewis. One of my favorite C.S. Lewis quotes is that pain, or we would say brokenness or whatever, is God's megaphone to a dying world. He's getting them, raising their attention towards eternity, towards spiritual things, towards himself. One of the things that I love about you and how the Lord has gifted you and directed you is that you use ping pong in the Y.
Table tennis.
Thank
Sorry.
you.
I didn't want to offend Doug. Stand up.
Forgive me for offending you. Table tennis and now pickleball.
Yeah.
As a platform to reach people for Christ in the Y. As you scan the pickleball courts and the table tennis tables, right?
Yeah.
What's going on in your mind as it relates to this text and all that you've discussed so far? Like, what's on your radar in terms of how to connect with people? Can you
Great question.
train us in that?
I think first thing is, get to know people's names.
Yeah.
You got to start as simple as it can be.
That's right.
And then I think the next step is, hey, tell me your story.
Yeah.
How long you been coming to the Y? What do you like about this place? And have you found your niche here? And you start to pick up little droppings of crumbs and things that might be helpful as you continue to move into their life relationally. As you get to know their name and you get to hear their story, you talk about pain. Often, I think we make the mistake when someone lets us know they're really not interested. I don't go to church, really, that's not my thing. I think we kind of write them off and just kind of
not interested.
Move on. They're not interested.
Hearts closed to the gospel.
And it's just so, this might sound a little harsh, but it's really empty-headed. It's empty-headed from the standpoint that just because they're not aware of any area in their life right now that they're thirsting doesn't mean they won't be a month from now. And often people are just one life circumstance away from having their whole apple cart upset, and all of a sudden they are now open.
Yeah.
And I have many stories like that where, I've just relationally stayed connected to a person. And when that one life circumstance happened, all of a sudden the ballgame changes. All of a sudden they're open maybe for me to pray for their situation.
Yep.
All of a sudden they're open to maybe start talking about spiritual things where they never had before. All of a sudden they might actually be willing to hear something from me from the Bible that relates to their situation. And I think that's kind of, again, the work of the evangelist is what we're trying to do is we're trying to help them see how God's story intersects their story and what they're going through. And that, to me, is the real challenge that we face, is how can I help them see that God's story actually intersects their story, and he's been there all along drawing them to himself, and that maybe this life circumstance is actually a knock-knock moment.
Yeah.
So
that's really good. Yeah, even before when we were just talking about this conversation, I wrote down a couple of things that I thought would be just like, how do we actually enter into people's brokenness or pain? And there are a lot of the things we've talked about. It's being willing to slow down enough to notice, which we talked about your story from Estes Park. I think we could all share stories of how, whether that you just shared that's one of the important things when you're playing pickleball and table tennis is you're noticing what's going on in people's life. Giving people space to process, I think, is really important. I know even if we're talking specifically about pain, the apple cart being tipped over, if you will, I found one of the most important times, like when I've been going through seasons of pain, even in my life. I know this isn't maybe necessarily an evangelism conversation, but I think in the way we relate to people going through painful seasons that don't know Jesus, it is people that are willing to just sit with me and let me experience my emotions are the safe people. And I think we want to be the safe people for people that are going through pain and suffering. So being willing to just ask questions like, how does it make you feel? What are you feeling? And sitting with people while they express those things without judgment, I just think is so important. Then I would say this is maybe different than your Estes Park story, because you would say you were almost given the term you used was holy hunch. But we don't always have the holy hunch, right? So being willing to not have the answers and just say, you know what?
That's true.
Bill, I also don't know why you're writing this children's book, but I'd love to keep engaging you in conversation over it. And I know God made you for a purpose. Maybe it's this, you know, and being willing to enter in. I think were some of the things that I wrote down, which I think we saw those reflected in some of the stories.
You hit on a big one there, and I think it's actually the whole idea of a book I wrote called God Space, to create a space where people feel safe enough to poke their spiritual heads out of their shell and actually talk about this without feeling like they're going to be condemned, judged, shamed, whatever. And I often like to remind people that, I don't know about you guys, but I'm not willing to receive a whole lot from someone I don't trust.
Yeah.
And so, Mike, back to your question, I think the biggest thing I can do in table tennis, pickleball, whatever, become the kind of person who is like, I'm fun, I'm entering in, I'm outgoing, I move towards people, but I also create a climate where somebody feels like they're safe with me and they can trust me. Because if they don't trust me, more than likely they're not going to receive from me. And sometimes it takes a long time, especially for skeptics and cynics, to have an environment where they actually do now trust, where before, like, that guy there, he's a chaplain. He's one of those kind of guys.
Right.
Sometimes just the language,
Yeah.
That we use. Pastor. I know about those pastor types.
Yeah.
And so sometimes we wear labels, and we have to kind of wear that label off so that somebody does trust us and is able to receive from us.
Yeah.
It's a good word,
That's
bro.
good. Well, hey, Mike, before we close this down, did you want to throw out a few discussion questions, or do you think we should just wrap it up? What do you think? I've got some written down if you want me to offer.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, great. So we're trying to just say, hey, if you're watching this, if you're listening to this, and you're on staff at the Y or on staff at a church, or if you go to a YMCA church, what would it look like for you to reflect on this a little further? And so I'm going to ask too, maybe that people can think about. If you guys have another one to throw in, feel free to throw it in. I would say one thing to think about is, when are the times you have felt the most known and seen by someone else in a conversation? And so therefore to then think about that and think, what were the things that were true of that conversation that I could apply in the way that I'm entering into other people's brokenness or pain and things like that. And I think such the important precursor, and this is a theme that we keep on talking about, but what would it look like for you to slow down enough that you're entering into someone else's brokenness or life? I think those are really good questions to practically think about.
It would be helpful even to take some time and go, you think of the people in your life. What are their struggles? Because the average person, when they walk into a room, all their thoughts are all consuming towards them, towards myself.
That must be just you. I don't think that way at all.
I wonder what this person's thinking about my shirt. I wonder if my pants fit right. I wonder if they like my shoes. I wonder what my hair looks like. I wonder if I have good breath or bad breath. I wonder, all about, myself. And if we could enter into situations, relationships, rooms, and say, what is that person going through? And how, Lord, how can I be used in that person's life? Those thoughts, as we pray them more, as we think them more, as we communicate them more prayerfully, the tide will rise for the church to be outward focused and to minister to others rather than all about me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. George Barna did some research that would be helpful to us in this conversation. He went out and asked people on the street, if you ever wanted to have a conversation with anybody about God or spiritual things, what would you hope that Christians would do or not do? The number one response, the one that got the most, was, I just wish they would listen without judgment. And I think too often, like introverts maybe listening in right now are going, listen, Doug, I can tell you're an extrovert. I can tell.
Sure.
I would never walk up to that guy who was looking at the elk and do something like that. But the reality is introverts have a leg up on extroverts when it comes to listening. They tend to be more given to that. And I think that in a post-Christian culture, I think we really need to learn how to listen people into the kingdom. That listening probably is the greatest evangelistic skill. We've always want to focus on talking, proclaiming, and all that, being tellers. The reality is people aren't necessarily lining up to hear what we want to tell them, but they are starved for someone out there who will just listen, for heaven's sake.
Yeah, well said. Well, hey, this was a great conversation. Yeah. I think there's a lot of really good nuggets here about what it looks like to enter into other people's lives. So, Doug, we're so grateful you joined us. If anyone is listening and they just want to know more about you or anything you've written, what would be the best way for them to either get in touch with you or find out more about some of the things you're passionate about?
Yeah, you can go to my website, which is godsgps.com, GODSGPS.com. You can find my book, God Space, on Amazon. And then I think for Y staff or people who have planted churches in the Y, I've got a resource to help pass on the big ideas of God Space. It's called Activating God Space, and it's a plug and play. All the notes have already been done for you, the questions, all that's put together, and you really guys get it and plug it and play it, and you're off and rolling. So.
Awesome.
That's great. Thanks, Doug.
And well, for everyone out there, if you want more information on us, you can go to our website, thecitymovement.com. There's ways to get in touch with us there. We'd love to get in contact with you. And Doug, thanks for joining us. This was a great conversation. For Doug Pollock and Mike Newman, this is Jeff Snyder. That was the City Movement Podcast.